Why are Mexicans called immigrants but Canadians called expats when moving to the US? I'm not sure if this helps. But if you're genuinely asking, an expat, which is short for expatriate, is a person who lives in another country, either permanently, or for an extended length. They usually keep their original nationality. An immigrant is defined as someone who has moved to another country permanently. Usually with immigrants, they intend to become citizens of the country they are living in. Is there even a distinction? A Canadian who moves to the States is a Canadian expat, but they are an immigrant to America. You know why? There are definitely racist connotations. But in addition to that, I think immigrant tends to suggest someone who left their country due to necessity, poor economic conditions, etc., while expat brings to mind someone who was fine back home but just wanted to experience living in a new country. So people who move from one wealthy country to another tend to be called expats. Also the racism. Probably elements of racism, but with Central and South American people, there's sort of the implication that they're forced to leave their homes. While with Canadians it's usually more of an active choice. But that would explain refugee and not immigrant. There definitely is racism or jingoism at play here. Canadians have a more similar culture and for the most part speak the same native language as Americans. So they are seen as more welcome here than Hispanic people. Generally it's accepted that an expat lives outside their own country for a period of time long or short. An immigrant is someone who permanently relocates to a different country. When I lived in some countries in Europe and Asia, I was an expat, since I got my green card and moved to the US. I'm an immigrant. In the example you give, I would imagine Canadian expats intend to return to Canada at some point. I wouldn't disagree with comments about implied racism though. I know plenty of Brits who permanently moved to an Asian country but still consider themselves expats. I've noticed many people in the comments keep pointing out that it's because Mexicans are brown. Mexicans, just like Canadians and Americans, come in all colors. Expat equals white with money, immigrant equals everyone else? This is a common misconception on the terms. In the US we would refer to anyone that came to the US from any other country as an immigrant. Any American that went to another country we would call an expat. So in Canada anyone who moved from another country would be called an immigrant, including someone who moved from the US, while a Canadian who had moved to another country would be called an expat. Anyone who has moved to another country could refer to themselves as either an immigrant or an expat. The amount of racism answers on here is disturbing. Has nothing to do with race and more to do with work visas. Immigrants move to an area to start a life which may or may not include getting a job. Expats are placed in a country by their employer. I've worked for a couple Japanese-owned companies. The Japanese engineers at my current company are called expats. They were sent here by the parent company. They stay for a couple years, then go back home to Japan. That's it. Racism. Racism. People fear Mexicans. But Canadians look like us. Immigrants are people moving to this country from anywhere. Folks who live and work in your country but have citizenship in another are expatriates. Immigrant implies you're moving there forever. Expat implies you're maintaining ties to your home country and will eventually return. One is white, the other brown. Canadians have better PR. An expat is someone who is planning on returning home, while an immigrant is someone who plans to stay there for life. In general, an immigrant is someone looking to build a life in the new country and eventually assimilate and become a citizen of that country. Expat is typically used to refer to someone who is living in a new country, but doesn't really have intentions to assimilate and become a citizen. When someone thinks of expats, it's usually wealthy people living in a foreign country but still claiming their original nationality. Ironically, many Mexicans today behave more like expats than immigrants, and many Canadians act more like immigrants than expats. Honestly, I've never heard of a Canadian in America that acted more Canadian than American and cared more about the politics of Canada than the US. But I've definitely seen that with Mexicans. Expats implies someone in the country temporarily for work or some other purpose. Immigrant implies someone coming to make a home indefinitely. Since people from poorer countries are more likely to come into a rich country to make a whole new life instead of a temporary work situation, then it's pretty common that most Mexicans are considered immigrants and most Canadians are expats. But there are certainly Canadian immigrants and Mexican expats. I know some of each. An immigrant is someone who moves to a country and wants to live there for the rest of their life. An expat is someone who moves to a country for only a few years, often because of work. Quality of life is so much better in the US than Mexico that there's few people who would want to go back to Mexico after being in the US. Since Canada has such a similar quality of life to the US, though there's many Canadians that only come to the US for work, then return home to Canada. I've never heard a single person refer to them as an expat. They're both immigrants and emigrants.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Eracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.